In the heart of Italy, where 7 hills overlook the Tiber River, lies a city that was not simply built but prophesied. Its name is Rome, before becoming the mistress of the known world before its legions. Its emperors and its law, Rome was merely an idea, a myth whispered in the shadows of prehistory. Its origin is not carved in stone but forged in a legend as violent as it is grand, a story of gods, of abandoned kings, and of a solitary she-wolf. This is the chronicle of the birth of a city that was destined from its very first day to be eternal, long before the name of Rome resonated across the world. The Italian peninsula was a hotbed of peoples. Etruscans, Latins, and Sabines competed for control of fertile land in a mosaic of fragile alliances and constant wars. It was a world governed by loyalty to the tribe and the will of the gods. But in this fragmented landscape, an ancient prophecy spoke of a city that would rise to rule them all. The story of Rome begins here, not as a fact, but as a destiny waiting to be fulfilled. The legend, immortalized by poets and historians, tells us of Romulus and Remus, twin brothers, grandsons of a deposed king, sons of a Vestal virgin, and, it is said, of the god of war himself, Mars, condemned to die by a usurping uncle. They were abandoned in a basket adrift on the Tiber, but the river, instead of claiming them, gently deposited them on the shore at the foot of the Palatine Hill. There they were found by a she-wolf, the Capitolina wolf, who, in an act that defies nature, nursed and protected them. This foundational myth is not a mere tale, it is the DNA of Rome. It speaks to us of a divine origin, of a wild connection to the land, and of a will to survive against all odds. Raised by a shepherd, the twins grew to become natural leaders, destined to avenge their grandfather and reclaim their lineage. After restoring the throne, they decided to found their own city in the very place where the she-wolf had saved them. But ambition, that force that would propel Rome to greatness, would also be its first curse. The brothers quarreled over which hill to choose and who would rule. The dispute culminated in tragedy. In a fit of rage and power, Romulus killed Remus. The eternal city was born from a fratricide. Its first wall was consecrated with the blood of a brother. This brutal act is perhaps the deepest truth hidden in the legend. It symbolizes a lesson that Rome would never forget. The construction of a state, of an empire, demands sacrifices. Unity is often forged with the sword. Romulus, now as the sole king, traced the sacred boundaries of his city and named it Rome. To populate it, he opened its doors to fugitives, exiles, and outcasts from all over Italy, creating a society of newcomers, a people without a past but with boundless ambition. As Rome emerged from its mythical origins, the reality of its surroundings imposed itself. The young city was surrounded by older and more powerful rivals, the Sabines, and above all the Etruscans, an advanced civilization with a rich culture, viewed this new neighbor with suspicion. The early years of Rome were a constant struggle for survival, a series of wars and strategic alliances. The legendary abduction of the Sabines, an act of violence to secure the future of the city, is another reflection of its pragmatic and often ruthless character. Rome learned from the very beginning that to expand, it had to absorb or destroy. The influence of its neighbors, especially the Etruscans, was indelible. From them, the Romans took their alphabet, their religious rituals, and their symbols of power, but they always maintained a fiercely independent identity. The tension between the patricians, the founding aristocracy, and the plebeians, the mass of newcomers, was already brewing in the heart of the city, foreshadowing centuries of social struggles that, paradoxically, would strengthen its institutions. Thus, on the threshold of history, we face the fundamental question that will guide our entire documentary. How could this small village of shepherds and outlaws born from a violent myth come to conquer the world? Was it the blessing of the gods, the cunning of its leaders, or an insatiable thirst for power that propelled its destiny? The answer, complex and nuanced, lies buried beneath the layers of history that we are about to unearth. As the legend of Romulus fades into time, a new era is about to begin. In the next chapter, we will delve into the period of the Roman monarchy, where 7 kings, some wise and others tyrants, shaped the first laws and institutions of Rome, setting the stage for the birth of the Republic and the onset of its unstoppable expansion. If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. That small city-state, forged in the crucible of legends and struggles, began to shape its destiny. In a landscape where history and myth intertwined, ancient Rome stood on the threshold of an era that defined its essence. The Roman monarchy. This period, often overshadowed by the Republic and the subsequent empire, offers a glimpse into the early political institutions and the figures who shaped the future of one of the most influential civilizations in history. The Roman monarchy spanned approximately from the founding of the city in 753 before Christ to the establishment of the Republic in 509 before Christ. In this context, it is crucial to understand the political and social environment. The Italian peninsula was a mosaic of tribes and peoples, mostly organized into independent communities. However, amidst this fragmentation, Rome emerged not only as a city, but as a symbol of unity and power. The early Roman political institutions, such as the Senate and the popular assemblies, began to take shape under the leadership of its kings. The figure of Romulus, the legendary founder, stands as an emblem of this era. According to tradition, Romulus not only founded the city, but also established the social division between patricians and plebeians, a distinction that would resonate throughout Roman history. There is debate over whether he was a hero or if his figure conceals greater complexity. Throughout the monarchy, other kings also left their mark. One of the most notorious was Tarquin the Proud, known for his tyranny. His reign symbolized both the rise and the fall of the monarchy. Tarquin sought to consolidate his power through the construction of grand works, such as the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitol and the expansion of territory. However, his decisions provoked growing discontent. The legend of his relationship with Lucretia, whose tragic story would be a catalyst for the overthrow of the monarchy, raises a question. How far can a king go in his quest for power before the people rise against him? The events that led to the fall of Tarquin the Proud are a tale of intrigue and rebellion. History tells that after the assault on Lucretia, a Roman noblewoman, her suicide unleashed the wrath of the Romans. Under the leadership of Lucius Junius Brutus, a relative of Lucretia, the citizens united in a cry for justice. The resistance echoed in the streets of Rome, and Tarquin's legacy became a symbol of monarchical oppression. As the Romans rose against the king, absolute power began to crumble. The revolt culminated in 509 before Christ, when Tarquin was expelled, marking the end of the monarchy and the beginning of the Republic. The immediate consequences of these events were profound. With the fall of the monarchy, Rome was propelled to create a new political system that sought to prevent the concentration of power. The Senate was established as the heart of the new order, and the consuls emerged as elected leaders. This change not only transformed the structure of government, but also laid the foundations for the future expansion of Rome. However, the aftermath of the monarchy did not completely dissipate. Its influence was still present on the political horizon. Thus, in the wake of these transformations, a question arises that endures through the centuries. What secrets of the Roman monarchy still lie hidden beneath the layers of time? The history of Rome is not merely the chronicle of a people, but a tapestry of legends, betrayals, and aspirations that shaped its identity. As the city ventured into the new republican order, the challenges and tensions between the different social classes would begin to take shape. The next chapter will lead us to explore the transition from monarchy to republic and how this radical change influenced the creation of a political system that sought to balance power between the Senate and the consuls. It is pertinent to analyze whether Rome was truly ready for this new chapter, or if the ghosts of its past were still present in its institutions. The fall of the monarchy was a time marked by instability and discontent. The previous system, which had ruled the city for centuries, began to fade away. In the streets of Rome, oppression loomed over the citizens. who longed for a change that promised a more equitable future. The figure of Tarquin the Proud, the last king, had become a symbol of tyranny, and his overthrow would not only be an act of rebellion, but the beginning of a new era. The birth of the Republic. The historical context in which this transition occurs is vital to understanding the magnitude of the change. The politics of ancient Rome was a game of intrigue where power was concentrated in the hands of a few. The king's decisions were absolute. However, discontent among the common people was growing. These grievances culminated in a collective outcry that resonated throughout Rome. The search for a more representative system began to take shape. A system that promised to balance power. Among the figures that emerged during this period of upheaval, Lucius Junius Brutus stands out as one of the leaders of the revolt. Brutus, a patrician disillusioned by the tyranny of Tarquin, became a symbol of resistance. Driven by a sense of justice, his decision to lead the overthrow of the king was crucial. History recounts that upon learning of the outrage against his family by Tarquin, Brutus made the decision to raise his voice and take the reins of a revolution. The night when the overthrow was planned was a mix of nervousness and determination. The conspirators gathered in secret. The figure of Tarquin became a target of contempt. The revolt erupted, and in a dramatic turn of events, Tarquin was expelled, marking the end of the monarchy and the dawn of the Republic. With the fall of the king, the Romans faced the task of creating a new political system. The Republic was not simply a form of government, it was a promise that power would be shared among multiple institutions. The role of the Senate was reaffirmed, becoming the bastion of the aristocracy, while the consuls, elected annually, embodied the executive. This duality of power sought to prevent the tyranny that had characterized the monarchy. However, this new system was not without conflicts. As the foundations were established, tensions between the patricians and the common people began to sharpen. The Senate, dominated by the patricians, sought to maintain its influence. On the other hand, the common people, raising their voices for their rights, began to question a system that still favored the elite. The key decisions made by the first consuls, such as Antonio and Brutus, defined the course of the new republic. They faced the difficult task of balancing the demands of the common people with those of the patricians. The creation of new magistrates, such as the tribunes of the common people, was an attempt to give representation to the lower classes, but the struggle for power intensified. It is debated whether a real balance was achieved or if a tyrant was simply replaced by an equally oppressive system. The immediate consequences of the establishment of the Republic were profound. Rome began to expand and consolidate its power on the Italian peninsula. The new political structure allowed for greater citizen participation, but it also became the breeding ground for internal conflicts. The struggle for power would become a cycle that would mark Roman history. Nevertheless, despite the advances, the question of the transition to the Republic would endure. It is examined whether Rome had managed to free itself from tyranny or if it had simply changed its form of oppression. The influence of the monarchy was still present, and past decisions reverberated in every new election. As the Romans adapted to their new reality, the republican system faced challenges. The struggle of the orders, the conflict between patricians and common people would begin to mark the next chapter. It is pertinent to analyze whether the common people would achieve equal rights or if their hopes would fade in the face of the intransigence of the aristocracy. The answers to these questions would define not only the future of Rome, but also the legacy it would leave in history. The establishment of the Republic gave rise to a social issue that would mark the fate of Rome. The new system, still young, found itself caught between two opposing forces, each with its own vision. At one end were the patricians, the aristocracy that had enjoyed privileges, and at the other, the plebeians, the vast majority who cried out for recognition and rights. The struggle between these two orders would not only define the political future of Rome, but also reveal the deep fissures in its social structure. The historical context of this struggle is situated in the 5th century before Christ, a period characterized by the growing tension between these classes. While the patricians monopolized political and religious power, the plebeians, who constituted the majority of the population, worked as farmers, artisans, and soldiers, but lacked the representation they deserved. In this environment, the voices of the plebeians began to resonate more strongly, demanding change. It is pertinent to analyze how a society that believed itself founded on justice could allow such inequality. The key figures in this drama were emblematic characters from both orders. On one side, the patricians, with leaders like Publius Valerius Publicola, who tried to advocate for the rights of the plebeians, and on the other, the plebeians, who saw the rise of their own defenders, such as Spurius Cassius, a tribune of the plebe who would become a symbol of resistance. Decision-making did not only depend on the interests of the elites, but also responded to a growing popular outcry. The proposed reforms were seen as a threat by the patricians. The events that would mark this struggle began in the year 494 before Christ, when the plebeians, tired of oppression, decided to carry out the first secession of the plebe. This act of civil disobedience, which led them to withdraw to the sacred mountain, was a demand for justice. There, a new power emerged, the tribunes of the plebe, who gained the ability to veto decisions harmful to their class. Through this act, the plebeians not only expressed their discontent, but also began to forge a new political identity. The secession had immediate consequences. The patricians, faced with the threat of losing their workforce and soldiers, were forced to negotiate. In the year 493 before Christ, the first peace treaty between both groups was signed, laying the groundwork for a change in the legal structure. However, the question was whether these reforms would be sufficient to quell the plebeians' desires. As time progressed, the plebeians continued to fight for their rights. In the decade of 450 before Christ, the creation of the Laws of the 12 Tables, a set of written laws, represented a crucial advancement. However, the struggle would not stop there. It was debated whether it would be possible to achieve true equality or if inequality would persist. With each plebeian victory, the patricians were forced to yield, but they never renounced their power. The struggle of the orders became a cycle of advances and setbacks. Reforms were often insufficient and resulted in new tensions. In this context, figures like Lucius Cornelius Sulla and later Julius Caesar became crucial actors. The plebeians' desire for equality would continue to resonate, but with each victory arose a new dilemma about whether it would be possible to maintain the unity of Rome. As the plebeians gained more representation, the patricians began to see their privileges threatened. Tension reached a new peak in the decade of 300 before Christ, with the creation of new institutions such as the Council of the Plebe. However, this progress brought with it a new question. It is analyzed whether the growing plebeian participation would lead to true representation or if it would become a facade for patrician control. Ultimately, the struggle of the orders culminated in reforms that established a more balanced system. The Hortensian Law of 287 before Christ was a turning point, as it granted the decisions of the Council of the Plebe the same weight as those of the Senate. This victory was celebrated as a triumph of the plebe, but it also left an open question for historians about whether inequality had truly disappeared or if it had transformed into a new type of struggle for power. The struggle of the orders in Rome is a reflection of the human dilemma for power and equity. As plebeians and patricians faced off, their battle resonated not only in the streets of Rome but among all those who yearned for justice. History teaches that the path to equality is fraught with challenges, and it leaves us with a question: how much are we willing to fight for our rights, and what sacrifices are we willing to make? Thus, the analysis of the struggle of the orders becomes a mirror of eternal tensions. The history of Rome does not stop here, as the expansion of its territory will bring new challenges. The next stage will focus on the conquest of the Italian peninsula, where alliances and conflicts will mark the pulse of a rising empire. It is pertinent to analyze whether Rome was ready to face the challenges that glory and power had in store for it. The internal struggle for power expanded beyond the walls of Rome, spreading across the Italian peninsula. In the 4th century before Christ, a new chapter opened in the history of Rome, marked by a desire for control. The Roman Republic, still young, found itself at a crossroads where alliances and conflicts with other city-states would define its destiny. Italian expansion would not be merely a matter of military conquest, but a complex web of political strategies and agreements. During this period, the Italian peninsula was inhabited by various tribes and city-states, a mosaic of cultures and languages, from the Etruscans in the north to the Samnites in the south. Each group had its own traditions. In this context, Rome, barely an emerging player, sought to consolidate its position amid a fragmented political landscape. The tensions between these city-states, along with Rome's ambitions, would create a favorable environment for expansion. The Roman leaders of the time, such as the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio and the dictator Cincinnatus, understood that the key to expansion lay not solely in strength, but in the creation of strategic alliances. The policy of divide and conquer became a crucial tool. Rome dedicated itself to forging alliances with some cities, offering protection in exchange for loyalty, while others, deemed rivals, were conquered. The first major test of Rome's expansionist will came with the wars against the Volscians and the Equians. The Roman victory in these contests not only consolidated its military power, but also sent a clear message to other city-states. Roman control was a reality. However, the Romans faced fierce resistance, especially from the Samnites, a warrior people fighting for their independence. The Samnite Wars, which unfolded between 343 before Christ and 290 before Christ, became the stage for a titanic struggle. The Samnites inflicted significant defeats on the Roman forces in the early phases. However, the adaptability of the Romans proved to be their greatest virtue. With each defeat, the Roman strategy was refined. The consolidation of the legion, a military system that prioritized discipline, transformed Rome into a war machine. But expansion was not solely about battles. In a crucial turn, Rome also opted for diplomacy. The creation of the Latin League, a confederation of Italic cities, was an innovative step that allowed them to incorporate their allies instead of destroying them. This strategy of cooperation proved to be a success as it transformed Rome into a recognized leader. The victory over the Samnites was a milestone. In 290 before Christ, the war concluded with the capitulation of the Samnites, who were ultimately absorbed. This victory came at a high cost. The Republic became embroiled in a series of conflicts that left a deep mark. The lesson learned was clear. War is a means for expansion, but the human cost must be considered. The repercussions of these victories resonated throughout the peninsula. The cities that once resisted Rome began to see the convenience of allying. The promises of protection and prosperity proved irresistible. For example, the conquest of Capua in 343 before Christ marked a turning point. Capua not only provided economic resources, but also offered an important port. However, despite these advances, Roman expansion was not a clear path. Tensions with other peoples, such as the Etruscans and the Gauls, continued. The threat of external invasions was constant, and often Rome had to deal with internal conflicts. The issue of citizenship became relevant, raising ethical and political dilemmas about how to integrate conquered cities without provoking discontent. The complexity of Roman expansion lay in its ability to adapt. Each conquered city brought a new set of challenges. The lingering question was how far Rome was willing to go to maintain its power. Roman ambition, combined with its political ingenuity, granted them an advantage. But the path to total control was fraught with uncertainties. With the Italian peninsula under its control, Rome found itself in a privileged position to look beyond. Expansion had been a transformation of Roman identity. With each victory, the Republic drew closer to becoming an empire. However, this metamorphosis would bring new challenges, which would manifest in conflicts with powers such as Carthage. Thus, as war loomed over the peninsula, Rome prepared to face a new enemy. The Punic Wars were just around the corner, a confrontation that would not only define the future of Rome but also leave an indelible mark on the history of the Mediterranean. It is pertinent to analyze whether Rome could face the impending challenge. History was about to reveal it. If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. The expansion in Italy gave rise to a conflict that would define the history of Rome. The Punic Wars, a confrontation between Rome and Carthage, not only marked the rise of Rome as a Mediterranean power, but also unleashed a series of events that would leave indelible marks on Western civilization. In the 3rd century before Christ, the political and social environment of Rome was charged with ambition. Having consolidated its control over the Italian peninsula, Rome had grown in power. However, its expansion did not go unnoticed. Carthage, a Phoenician city-state in present-day Tunisia, stood as a formidable competitor. With a vast commercial empire, Carthage had accumulated wealth. The tension between these two powers intensified as both aspired to control trade routes and strategic territories. In this context, key players began to emerge. On one side, Rome had leaders like the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio the Elder, whose determination would be crucial. On the opposing side, Hannibal Barca stood out as the Carthaginian commander, a strategist whose audacity would turn him into a legend. The decisions of both leaders would shape the fate of their nations. The first act, the First Punic War, erupted in 264 before Christ, when Rome intervened in a dispute in Sicily. The war was prolonged and marked the beginning of a conflict that would last more than 2 decades. The naval battles were a revelation of Roman ingenuity. Despite its lack of naval experience, Rome developed a fleet and employed tactical innovations such as the corvus, a device that allowed boarding enemy ships. The Roman victories in battles such as that of the Aegates Islands in 241 before Christ sealed the fate of Carthage, which was forced to accept harsh peace conditions. Rome emerged victorious and established itself as the dominant power in Sicily. A victory that expanded its territory and granted it access to trade routes. However, the victory was only a prelude. The defeat resonated in Carthage, awakening a desire for revenge. A new leader was needed, and Hannibal Barca answered this call. His oath of hatred towards Rome became the driving force of the Second Punic War, which erupted in 218 before Christ. Hannibal proved to be a formidable adversary. The famous crossing of the Alps, where he led his army, including his elephants, became one of the most memorable episodes in military history. It is debated how a Carthaginian leader could challenge a rising power in such a way. The answer lay in his tactical cunning. Once in Italy, Hannibal achieved a series of crushing victories in battles such as that of Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and culminating in the legendary Battle of Cannae in 216 before Christ. In this last confrontation, his numerically inferior army managed to surround and annihilate the Roman forces in a tactical deployment studied by strategists throughout history. The defeat was devastating for Rome. However, the Roman reaction was notable. The Senate chose Publius Cornelius Scipio, who adopted a different approach. Instead of confronting Hannibal in Italy, Scipio took the war to the heart of Carthage. The decisive battle took place at Zama in 202 before Christ, where Scipio faced Hannibal in a duel that would decide the future. Scipio's victory at Zama not only ended the Second Punic War, but transformed Rome into the superpower of the Mediterranean. The conditions imposed on Carthage were severe, stripping the city of its empire. The aftermath of this conflict would stretch for years. With the conclusion of the Punic Wars, a question arises. Was Rome's victory an absolute triumph or the beginning of a cycle of revenge? Rome's ambition would lead it to new conquests, but at a high cost. Thus, as the consequences of the battle settled, Rome prepared to take an even bolder step. The conquest of the Mediterranean would not only be a continuation of its expansion, but a journey to the heart of civilization. In the next chapter, we will explore how Rome, driven by the legacy of the Punic Wars, launched into an era of conquests beyond Italy. The Punic Wars gave rise to a series of ambitious military campaigns that would take Rome beyond the borders of Italy, unleashing an era of conquest. The expansion across the Mediterranean, a complex process, would mark the fate of the city and the civilizations surrounding it. In this chapter, we will unravel how Rome ventured into Greece, Hispania, and North Africa, weaving a tapestry of victories and defeats. The historical context at the end of the 3rd century before Christ is steeped in tensions. After the victory over Carthage, the power of Rome was consolidated on the Italian peninsula, but the horizon extended beyond. The Greek city-states, weakened by internal struggles, presented both a challenge and an opportunity. In North Africa, Carthage, although defeated, still retained vestiges of its former splendor. Hispania, rich in resources, became an attractive target, but also a dangerous terrain. In this landscape of ambition, key figures emerge. One of the most prominent is General Publius Cornelius Scipio, known as Scipio the African, who, after his triumph in the Second Punic War, would become the architect of the conquest of Hispania. On the other hand, in the Greek sphere, the figure of Quintus Fabius Maximus, known as the Cunctator for his strategy of delay, presents himself as a character who knew how to buy time while Rome restructured. The expansion into Greece began in the year 200 before Christ, when Rome became involved in the complex web of alliances in the region. The Macedonian Wars reveal the Roman ambition to extend its territory and cement its cultural influence. The decisive victory at the Battle of Pydna in 168 before Christ not only marked the end of the Kingdom of Macedonia, but also the beginning of a new chapter in the relationship between Rome and Greece, turning the latter into a province. Meanwhile, in Hispania, Roman campaigns faced fierce resistance. The Iberian and Celtiberian peoples presented a formidable challenge. The Battle of Ilipa in 206 before Christ stood as a milestone, where Scipio achieved a victory that sealed the Roman fate on the peninsula. However, the conquest of Hispania would not be straightforward. Resistance would continue for decades. In North Africa, the influence of Carthage was still present. Although the city had been destroyed in 146 before Christ, the desire for expansion did not cease. The creation of the province of Africa was a crucial step in consolidating Roman power. As the Romans settled, they began to build an infrastructure that would facilitate administration and trade. The immediate consequences of these campaigns were profound. The conquest of the Mediterranean not only expanded the borders of Rome, but also brought an unprecedented cultural blend. Greek and African influences intertwined with Roman tradition, enriching its art and philosophy. However, this growth also sowed tensions. The system of clientelism generated inequalities that would fuel discontent, foreshadowing future crises. The question posed in this chapter is clear. It is debated whether this quest for conquest was a path to greatness or a road to self-destruction. The victories of Rome opened doors, but they also left wounds. The decisions of leaders like Scipio and Fabius Maximus reveal the moral and ethical dilemmas they faced. It is pertinent to analyze how far Rome was willing to go to consolidate its power and what price future generations would pay. Thus, the conquest of the Mediterranean stands as a remarkable chapter in the history of Rome, a journey filled with glory and tragedy that would set the stage for the crisis of the Republic. The decisions made in those years would extend over the history of Rome, while the consequences of war and ambition would resonate among the Romans. In the next chapter, we will explore how internal tensions began to wear down the republican structure. It is pertinent to analyze whether Rome could sustain its legacy in the face of adversities. The territorial expansion revealed itself in the depths of the Roman Republic, a political system that was beginning to show signs of weakness. In the twilight of the 2nd century before Christ, internal tensions intensified. A discord that would resonate through the centuries. The Republic, once a model of balance, now found itself in a labyrinth of power struggles, agrarian reforms, and growing social polarization. The political and social environment preceding these events was marked by increasing dissatisfaction. The territorial expansion had brought wealth, but also deep inequalities. Lands began to be hoarded by the elite landowners, who consolidated their power to the detriment of the middle class. The figure of the Roman peasant, who had been the heart of the army, was fading, replaced by an urban proletariat. Corruption in the Senate became commonplace, leaving many Romans wondering where the promise of an egalitarian republic had gone. Among the protagonists of this crisis were figures such as Tiberius Gracchus, a tribune of the plebeians who rose with the intention of returning land to the peasants. His agrarian reform proposal, the Lex Sempronia Agraria, sought to limit the amount of land that an individual could possess, but his plan was met with resistance. The senators, fearful of losing their privileges, saw Tiberius as a dangerous radical. The atmosphere became tense, and violence began to loom over Rome. The story of Tiberius Gracchus is one of tragedy. In the year 133 before Christ, after an intense debate, he was assassinated by a group of senators. His death symbolized the beginning of a period of instability. It is debated whether his sacrifice was merely a pretext to cover up the deep divisions that were already tormenting Rome. The repercussions of his assassination resonated in the figure of his brother, Gaius Gracchus, who would continue his legacy. Gaius, also a tribune of the plebeians, became a defender of the interests of the lower class. His proposals included the creation of colonies, the reduction of grain prices, and the extension of political rights. The tension between the classes intensified. In the year 121 before Christ, Gaius Gracchus also met his end, assassinated in a confrontation. The Republic seemed to have lost its way. As agrarian reforms became a battleground, other leaders exacerbated the crisis. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a general, returned to Rome with a loyal army, determined to take control. His rise to power marked a drastic change, as he used violence to impose his will. In the year 88 before Christ, Sulla became dictator, dissolving the Republic. His mandate was characterized by a purge of his political enemies. The crisis of the Republic manifested not only in the political realm but also in the social fabric. The struggle between the optimates, who defended the aristocracy, and the populares, who represented the lower classes, intensified. This conflict, fueled by the ambition of leaders such as Sulla and Gaius Marius, reflected a fragmented society. The secrets of this power struggle are still being investigated. The events of this era reflected a change in the perception of power. Loyalty to the state began to be replaced by loyalty to the general. The militarization of Roman politics became a disturbing phenomenon. Generals began to see the Republic as an obstacle to their ambitions. The figure of the soldier transformed into an instrument of war. The crisis culminated in a series of civil wars. The struggle between Sulla and Marius was merely a prelude. Over time, the conflicts became a macabre dance. The Republic, which had once been a symbol of balance, was crumbling. The immediate consequences were devastating. Political instability and violence led to growing distrust. The lack of unity and the weakening of institutions opened the door to external threats. Agrarian reforms ended in a cycle of conflict. The question surrounding this period is profound. It is debated whether the crisis of the Republic was the result of the corruption of a few or of a society that had lost its way. The Republic had been designed to be a system of balances, but cracks began to appear. The question persists as to whether the Republic could have been saved. As the repercussions of the crisis resonated in Rome, a new actor was emerging. The figure of Julius Caesar, a charismatic general, was about to enter the scene, marking the beginning of a new era. With his rise, the Republic was extending, heralding a radical change. The crisis of the Republic gave way to a phenomenon that would forever change the face of Rome: the rise of Julius Caesar. In a time when the political system was teetering under the weight of corruption, a leader emerged whose name would resonate through the centuries. Son of a patrician family, Caesar not only navigated the turbulent political waters of his time, but also forged a destiny that would lead him to become the most powerful man in Rome. The historical context preceding his rise is crucial for understanding his decisions. At the end of the 1st century before Christ, Rome found itself at a crossroads. The Punic Wars had left wealth, but also inequality. The wave of agrarian reforms and the conflicts between patricians and plebeians had intensified tensions. In this environment, the figure of Caesar emerged as a remarkable issue. It is pertinent to analyze how one man could become the savior of a republic on the brink of collapse. Julius Caesar's political career began in 84 before Christ when he was elected quaestor. From those early steps, his ambition became evident. Caesar understood that Roman politics was a battlefield where military victories could catapult a man to glory. On his journey, he stood out as a skilled orator and a shrewd politician, uniting his followers around promises of reforms. The secrets of his charisma are still being investigated. It would not be until the year 58 before Christ that Caesar would initiate his campaign in Gaul, a series of wars that would expand the borders of Rome and cement his reputation as a formidable commander. For almost a decade, Caesar fought, conquering Gallic tribes. The battles of Bibracte and Alesia became legendary, where his military ingenuity led him to victory. However, after each triumph, the question persisted about how far he was willing to go to achieve absolute power. As Caesar reaped successes in Gaul, the political situation in Rome became more volatile. Rivalries between leaders such as Pompey and Crassus created an atmosphere of distrust. In 60 before Christ, Caesar established the First Triumvirate with these two men, an informal alliance that allowed him to consolidate his power. But the ambitions of each would soon clash. It is debated whether this fragile union could withstand the pressure of personal aspirations. As Gaul surrendered, Caesar began to send his commentaries on the Gallic War, where he described his exploits. These works served not only to inform the Senate, but also to forge his image. In a remarkable twist, Caesar became a popular hero, while his rivals watched as his power increased. It is questioned whether the Roman people were aware of the danger posed by a man with such influence. With the completion of his campaign in 51 before Christ, Caesar returned to Rome at a time when his relationship with Pompey had deteriorated. The tension culminated in a civil war in 49 before Christ. With the famous phrase, "the die is cast," he crossed the Rubicon, an act that unleashed a series of events that would lead Caesar to dictatorship. It is pertinent to analyze whether this act of defiance was one of courage or a mark of his ambition. The civil war unleashed bloody confrontations, where Caesar demonstrated his skill by defeating Pompey's forces at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 before Christ. However, the triumph did not come without cost. The death of Pompey in Egypt left Caesar with a power vacuum. In this context, his relationship with Cleopatra would become a crucial point in his life, both personal and political. It is debated whether Caesar could maintain the balance between his desire for power and the complexities of international politics. Once in Rome, Caesar proclaimed himself perpetual dictator in 44 before Christ, a title that for many sounded like king. His reforms, although well-intentioned, generated discontent among the senators, who saw in him a threat to republican liberties. His ambition loomed over the city, and the words of his detractors resonated. Was Caesar a savior or a tyrant? The immediate consequences of his rise were profound. Caesar implemented reforms that benefited the most disadvantaged citizens, but his growing authoritarianism alienated many. The tension culminated in his assassination on the 15th of March in 44 before Christ. An act that would not only seal his fate, but also unleash a series of events that would lead the Republic to its collapse. It is questioned whether his tragic end could have been avoided or if his fate was sealed. The question surrounding the figure of Julius Caesar persists. His legacy, marked by great victories and a violent end, raises questions about the cost of power and human ambitions. In a world where history witnesses the fragility of leadership, Caesar stands as a figure of complexity and contradiction. It is pertinent to analyze what lessons can be drawn from his life and what secrets lie hidden in his ambition. As history progresses, we find ourselves facing a new theme: the repercussions of his assassination and how these events would give way to a new order in Rome. The death of Caesar would not be the end of his influence, but the beginning of a struggle for power that would reconfigure the destiny of the Republic. It will be analyzed whether the Romans were prepared to face the storm that was approaching. The dictatorship that Caesar had forged in Republican Rome sowed the seeds of its own destruction. In a politically charged environment, ambition echoed through the streets of the city. The figure of Caesar loomed like a colossus. But his rise was not met with unanimous applause. In Roman politics, conspiracies and whispers emerged that foretold his downfall. Rome in the early 1st century before Christ was a mosaic of loyalties and rivalries. A system that had functioned for centuries was on the brink of collapse. The struggle between patricians and plebeians had left deep scars, and territorial expansion had created discontent. Caesar, a charismatic man and militarily astute, had managed to conquer not only his enemies but also the masses, winning their support by offering reforms. But this very power that elevated him also made him a target of intrigue. Among the main actors in this plot were figures such as Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus, who, although once allies of Caesar, began to see him as a threat to the Republic. For them, Caesar's reforms were a sign of tyranny, a step towards the disregard of institutions. In their minds, the only way to restore freedom was to eliminate the dictator. This moral dilemma, whether the conspiracy was an act of salvation or betrayal, became the central axis of their decisions. The year 44 before Christ marked the climax of this tension. On the 15th of March, a day that would go down in history as the Ides of March, the plot would unfold. In the days leading up to it, the conspirators met in secret, discussing every detail. The atmosphere was charged with fatality. Each step towards the assassination of Caesar was a manifestation of the history of Rome, a history of ambition and betrayal. The fateful day arrived, and Caesar headed to the Senate, ignoring the warnings. Beware the Ides of March, an augur had warned him, but Caesar dismissed the omen. It was in that setting where chaos erupted. Cassius, Brutus, and other conspirators lunged at him, and in a moment, the daggers gleamed. The words of his friend Brutus, "You too, Brutus," echoed in the air, a lament that encapsulated betrayal. The blood of Caesar stained the floor of the Senate, and with his death, one cycle closed, but another, darker one began to open. The repercussions of this act were immediate. The death of Caesar triggered a wave of chaos in Rome. The streets that had once vibrated with popular support were now scenes of confusion. Political instability took hold of the city, and factions that had previously remained in the background began to emerge. The power vacuum left Rome in a state of uncertainty. The question of who would assume leadership now was raised. The assassination of Caesar not only unleashed an internal struggle in the Senate, but also led to a broader battle between his supporters and detractors. Mark Antony, ally and general of Caesar, rose as one of the main defenders of his memory, while the conspirators tried to justify their action before an increasingly divided populace. The figure of Caesar became a symbol not only of power but of the struggle for the future of the Republic. His death, far from being the end, transformed into the catalyst that would trigger a series of events leading to the collapse of the Republican system. Thus, the question surrounding the fall of Caesar is not limited to who killed him, but expands to the implications of his death and the fate of Rome. It is debated whether Caesar could have survived had he heeded the warnings, or if his fate was already sealed by the power he accumulated. The answers to these questions linger in the air, like the stories of those who once walked the same streets. Amidst this turmoil, a new order emerged. Alliances were forged and broken, and betrayal resonated in every corner of the city. The fall of Caesar not only marked the end of an era, but also paved the way for the rise of a new power that would consolidate over time: the Second Triumvirate. Thus, while the repercussions of his death still reverberated, Rome prepared to face a new battle, a struggle for control that would forever mark the course of its history. The death of Caesar ushered in a new era of alliances and rivalries. In the wake of this event, a power vacuum spread across Rome, an abyss that cried out to be filled. Political instability and a thirst for vengeance would mark the birth of the Second Triumvirate, an alliance among three of the most powerful men of the time: Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. This chapter reveals how former friends became strategic allies in an attempt to restore order and avenge the death of the dictator. In a context where betrayal and power were ever present, the political atmosphere of Rome in the year 44 before Christ was a boiling storm. Following Caesar's assassination, the senators who had participated in the conspiracy believed they had restored the freedom of the Republic. However, the reality was very different. Caesar's death had sown chaos, and a struggle for power between his supporters and detractors began to take shape. Caesar's followers, among them Mark Antony, sought revenge, while others, like the young Octavian, his adopted heir, faced the difficult task of consolidating the legacy of their posthumous father. In this situation of shifting loyalties and ambitions, the figure of Lepidus, less known but no less crucial, emerged as a mediator. Mark Antony, a charismatic general, had been one of Caesar's closest allies. After his death, his desire for justice led him to ally with Octavian, who had the support of the legions and a growing popularity. The decision to join forces was not easy. There was rivalry and distrust between them, but the need to avenge Caesar in the face of the threat posed by the Republicans, led by Cicero, overcame their differences. The formation of the Triumvirate was an act of political pragmatism, a strategic union that promised to restore order in Rome. Lepidus, although less famous, played a fundamental role by serving as a bridge between Octavian and Antony. He was an ambitious man, but his power was limited. However, his influence as high priest granted him a status that should not be underestimated. With this trio in power, the alliance was formalized in the year 43 before Christ, constituting one of the most notable coalitions in Roman history. It is pertinent to analyze what secrets and hidden loyalties lurked beneath the surface of this alliance. As the Triumvirate consolidated, the first step was to avenge Caesar. The Battle of Philippi in the year 42 before Christ would become the decisive stage. The forces of Antony and Octavian faced Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, in a conflict that marked the beginning of the struggle for control of Rome. The victory at Philippi was a significant triumph. The victorious army was composed of loyal legions, and in the end, the conspirators were forced to commit suicide. The immediate consequences of the victory at Philippi were profound. Mark Antony's position strengthened, especially due to his success in battle. Octavian, although less charismatic on the battlefield, knew how to leverage the victory to consolidate his image as the legitimate successor of Caesar. Lepidus found himself in a compromised situation, watching as his companions amassed power at his expense. Amid this atmosphere, new questions arose about whether the Triumvirate could remain united in the face of the growing ambitions of its members, or if internal conflict was destined to consume their alliance. Over time, each triumvir's ambition would turn into a struggle for absolute power. As loyalties blurred, disagreements began to surface. Mark Antony, seduced by Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, drifted away from Octavian's plans, who soon saw this relationship as a threat. Meanwhile, Lepidus was relegated to a secondary role. The Triumvirate, which had begun as a promise of restoration, was starting to crumble. The analysis of the Second Triumvirate lies in how an alliance forged by necessity became a battleground of ambitions. It is pertinent to examine the mysteries behind these men's decisions and how far they would go to secure their power. The history of Rome was entering a new and dangerous phase. As the repercussions of the Battle of Philippi resonated in Rome, the fundamental question emerged forcefully. Would this be the last time Rome saw a union among friends, or was it merely the prelude to an even more devastating war? With tension mounting, the next chapter loomed dark. The Battle of Actium was approaching, a confrontation that would seal the fate of Rome. It is debated who would prevail in this struggle of titans. History was about to reveal it. The struggle for power reached levels of intensity that were previously unimaginable. In the twilight of the Republic, the tensions between Octavian and Mark Antony would become the epicenter of a conflict that would not only determine their fates, but also seal the future of Roman civilization. The Battle of Actium, a naval confrontation that took place in 31 before Christ, stands as a crucial moment in history, an event shrouded in betrayal, ambition, and military strategy. The historical context surrounding Actium is complex. Following the assassination of Julius Caesar, Rome was plunged into political chaos. The Second Triumvirate, as previously mentioned, had been conceived as a temporary solution. However, the alliances were fragile. Mark Antony had sought support from Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, which generated tensions that resonated throughout the Roman world. The perception of betrayal, coupled with the growing popularity of Octavian, began to polarize Roman society. In this context, the loyalty of the legions became paramount, and the struggle for control of the empire intensified. The protagonists of this historical drama are figures of great stature. Octavian, the adopted heir of Julius Caesar, was a shrewd young man whose rise to power was based on his ability to manipulate public perceptions. On the other hand, Mark Antony, the charismatic general and lover of Cleopatra, symbolized Rome's connection to the Eastern world, but his increasing dependence on Egypt placed him in a vulnerable position. The decisions of both men would be crucial. While Octavian opted for a propaganda campaign to discredit Antony, the latter, caught between his love for Cleopatra and his loyalty to Rome, found himself at a crossroads. It is debated whether he could truly trust an alliance forged in Egypt. The unfolding events that led to the Battle of Actium were a dance of strategy and deception. In the year 32 before Christ, Octavian decided that the time to act had come. He summoned the Senate, where he declared war on Cleopatra, presenting her as a threat to Rome. This move was calculated. By turning Cleopatra into the common enemy, Octavian sought to unite Rome under his leadership. Meanwhile, Mark Antony, commanding a formidable fleet, was positioned off the coast of Greece, ready to confront his rival. Tension reached its peak when Octavian, with the help of his general Agrippa, began to consolidate his forces. The climactic confrontation occurred in September of 31 before Christ in the Bay of Actium. Mark Antony's forces, although superior in number, were disadvantaged by Octavian's strategy. The battle erupted with a cacophony of ships and men in combat. Octavian, who had demonstrated his cunning by choosing the terrain, employed innovative naval tactics. His lighter fleet managed to encircle Antony's ships. In an unexpected turn, Cleopatra, seeing the imminent defeat, decided to withdraw her vessels, an act that triggered the rout of Antony's troops. The immediate consequences of the Battle of Actium were devastating for Mark Antony. The defeat not only meant the loss of his fleet, but also blurred his image as a leader. The news of his failure spread rapidly, and his reputation crumbled. Mark Antony and Cleopatra took refuge in Egypt, where the nature of their love and their loyalty to Rome became a matter of debate. Meanwhile, Octavian emerged as the victor, and his path to absolute power was clear. However, the Battle of Actium left unanswered questions. It is debated whether it was a conflict between Rome and Egypt, or a personal confrontation between two men with opposing visions. The story of Actium is also the story of ambition and betrayal. It is pertinent to analyze how far Octavian and Mark Antony were willing to go for power and what legacy their decisions left on the fate of Rome. The aftermath of Actium would extend beyond the battle itself, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. With the path cleared, Octavian would prepare to take the definitive step toward the creation of the Roman Empire. The transition from the Republic to a new form of government would raise new questions about freedom and control in the Rome that was to come. Thus, the repercussions of the battle would resonate into the future. A constant reminder that history is woven with the threads of ambition and betrayal. It is relevant to analyze the revelations that awaited in the next stage of this saga, where the legacy of an empire would be forged in the fires of discord. The victory at Actium became a crucial moment in the history of Rome. The Republic, a system founded on the balance of power, was on the brink of a radical transformation. On the horizon of events, a man emerged as a central figure in this political drama. Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, later known as Augustus. His rise to power would not only mark the end of an era, but also usher in a new phase in Roman history, the birth of the empire. The historical context in which these events unfolded was one of tension. The Roman Republic, which had reached its maximum expansion, was worn down by internal struggles. Civil wars, driven by the ambition of leaders such as Julius Caesar, had blurred the boundaries of legality. The assassination of Caesar on the Ides of March in 44 before Christ left chaos, and the power vacuum that followed opened the door to revenge. Amid this turmoil, Octavian emerged as an ambitious young man, an heir who had to confront not only Caesar's assassins but also figures such as Mark Antony and Lepidus. The characters at play were titans of Roman power. Octavian, at just 19 years old, had been adopted by Caesar and was considered his legitimate successor. His political cunning allowed him to maneuver in a hostile environment. Mark Antony, a charismatic general, sought to consolidate his own power and crossed paths with Octavian. Lepidus, the third member of the Second Triumvirate, acted as a mediator, although he would soon be overshadowed. In this context, the decisions of these men would be fundamental. The development of events leading to the birth of the empire was a series of maneuvers and confrontations. After Caesar's assassination, Octavian and Mark Antony joined forces to eliminate the dictator's assassins. The Battle of Philippi in 42 before Christ became a turning point. The forces of Octavian and Antony faced the followers of Brutus and Cassius, who perished in a clash that sealed the fate of the Republic. However, victory did not bring peace. It sowed discord between Octavian and Antony, whose visions were irreconcilable, as Mark Antony ventured eastward. Establishing alliances with Cleopatra of Egypt, Octavian consolidated his power in Rome. His strategy included propaganda that portrayed him as the defender of the Republic. As tensions escalated, the confrontation culminated in the naval Battle of Actium in 31 before Christ. Octavian's fleets, commanded by Agrippa, faced the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. Antony's defeat not only signified the end of his career but also the beginning of Octavian's ascendancy. The immediate consequences of these events were profound. With the victory at Actium, Octavian became the master of Rome. He returned triumphantly to the city. However, in his mind, the legacy of the Republic was a distant echo. In the year 27 before Christ, Octavian adopted the title of Augustus, a name that would resonate throughout history, symbolizing his power and his mission to restore order. This act marked the official beginning of the Roman Empire, putting an end to centuries of republican tradition. Despite his success, the transition was not a clear path. It is pertinent to analyze what tensions remained latent in this new order. The figure of Augustus, who presented himself as a restorer, was also a master of political control. His reign would bring lasting peace, but at the cost of political freedom. There is debate over whether the price of stability was the submission of the Roman people to a centralized power. The birth of the Roman Empire not only transformed the structure of government, it also altered the perception of Roman identity. The Pax Romana, which would be established, would bring cultural flourishing, but under the shadow of authoritarian control. History invites reflection on whether the empire was a rebirth for Rome or the beginning of its decline. As we explore the complexities of the empire under Augustus, the question arises of how this balance would be maintained. The Pax Romana, a period that would rise as a beacon of peace, would also pose new challenges in the narrative of the Roman legacy. History unfolds, ready to be unraveled in the chapters that follow. If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. The birth of the empire ushered in a period of remarkable stability and splendor. The Roman peace, a term that evokes not only peace but also a period of cultural and political prosperity, was established in the heart of the Roman Empire under the leadership of Augustus. This chapter delves into a time when wars and internal struggles dissipated, allowing Rome to flourish. In the historical context of the Roman peace, an empire in transition is revealed. The victory of Octavian, later known as Augustus, at the Battle of Actium in 31 before Christ marked the end of the Republican era and opened the floodgates to a new order. Ancient rivalries still resonated, but the new emperor was dedicated to restoring peace. Politics transformed, the consuls shared power with the prince, a concept that reconfigured the structure of government. It is debated whether a single man could truly maintain peace in a vast empire. Augustus, with cunning, became the architect of this era. His strategic decisions and ability to manipulate the dynamics of power were fundamental. The creation of an efficient provincial administration system and reforms in the army ensured control and well-being in the regions. The figure of Augustus became a symbol of Roman peace, but behind his success, questions arose about the nature of power. During this period, cultural prosperity flourished. Literature, architecture, and the arts reached new heights. Poets such as Virgil and Horace, under the influence of Augustus, created works that celebrated the greatness of Rome and reflected the tensions of the new regime. Monumental constructions, such as the Pantheon and the Ara Pacis, symbolized the grandeur of the empire but also revealed a desire for immortality. It is pertinent to analyze whether the Roman peace was a true rebirth or a facade that concealed tensions. The development of infrastructure was another pillar of its success. The construction of roads and aqueducts allowed for the expansion of trade and the integration of the provinces. The network of roads symbolized unity. However, this same network also facilitated dissent. It is questioned how such a vast empire could maintain peace when its arteries could be used for insurrection. The immediate consequences of the Roman peace were profound. Political stability allowed for an economic flourishing that fed culture. Cities thrived and trade expanded. However, this prosperity was not homogeneous. There were inequalities that would soon begin to manifest in the streets of Rome. Social tensions, ignored by the elites, would generate discontent that threatened to destabilize peace. It is debated whether a peace built on foundations of inequality was truly sustainable. The analysis of the Roman peace lies in its duality. On one hand, it presents itself as a golden period, but on the other, it is a time that concealed the seeds of future crises. The apparent tranquility of the Roman streets was merely a surface. It is questioned whether this peace, so celebrated, could be lasting in an empire where dissenting voices were beginning to rise. The Roman peace stood as a testament to Augustus's political ingenuity and the resilience of an empire that, despite its achievements, continued to face challenges. The history of this era intertwines with legends and tales that continue to resonate, posing questions that still trouble us today. An uncertain future began to take shape, and with it, the expectation of the next chapter. As the Roman peace solidified, imperial dynasties began to take form, marking the beginning of a new journey. It is pertinent to analyze what legacy these emperors would leave in their pursuit of glory. The transition to the era of emperors and dynasties is approaching, and with it, a new set of challenges and mysteries that would define the empire in the coming centuries. The Pax Romana was the calm that precedes the storm. In the vast tapestry of Roman history, power and ambition began to weave together with an unparalleled complexity. With the Republic teetering, the figure of the emperor emerged as a guide, promising order in a sea of uncertainties. The imperial dynasties, from the Julio-Claudians to the Antonines, not only shaped the destiny of a city, but also left an indelible mark on history. The historical context of this period is a manifestation of rivalries and struggles for power. The death of Julius Caesar marked the end of an era, but also the opening of a new chapter that would see the rise of individuals whose desire for control would redefine leadership. The political instability that followed his assassination created a power vacuum that was filled by charismatic and controversial figures. The chaos of the Republic faded before autocracy. The Julio-Claudians, the first imperial dynasty, emerged from this whirlwind. Augustus, heir to Caesar, became the first emperor in the 27 before Christ. It was he who transformed the political system, leaving behind the ancient republic. Through administrative reforms, Augustus established the foundations of the empire. It is pertinent to analyze the cost of this peace, known as Pax Romana, built upon the submission of republican liberties. Augustus's legacy was not limited to his rule. The dynasty continued with emperors such as Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. Each contributed to the narrative of an empire of contradictions. Tiberius, although initially competent, became a tyrant who ruled from caprice. It is debated whether the solitude of power transformed him or if there was a darkness within him from the beginning. Caligula became the personification of excess. His extravagances challenged norms. His story is remembered for his disdain for life, but it is debated whether his reign was a sign of the moral decay of the empire or a reflection of political tensions. Claudius, who rose during a time of chaos, showed a surprising capacity to govern. He expanded the empire, but his reign was marked by the influence of his wife Agrippina and his son Nero. Nero, with his fondness for the arts and his disdain for politics, led the empire to a turning point. His rule was a period of excesses and persecutions, particularly against Christians. The phrase "Nero blamed the Christians" became etched in collective memory. It is debated whether Nero was a monster or a product of a system that had begun to devour itself. The Julio-Claudian dynasty met its end with the suicide of Nero in the 68 after Christ, leaving Rome in anarchy in the year of the four emperors. This period was a crucible, highlighting the fragility of imperial power. Galba, Otho, and Vitellius vied for the throne. It was in this context that Vespasian emerged, founder of the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian, an experienced military leader, assumed power with the promise of restoring order. His rise marked a new era. The Flavians were distinguished by the construction of monuments such as the Colosseum, which symbolized the greatness of the empire and the entertainment that kept the people away from politics. It is debated whether the splendor of these works was a sign of prosperity or a distraction from underlying problems. Over time, the Flavian dynasty was succeeded by the Antonines, often considered the Golden Age. This era was defined by emperors such as Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Trajan, known for his conquests, and Hadrian, with his focus on consolidation, demonstrated that imperial power could be exercised effectively. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, represented the culmination of this dynasty. However, the question persists as to whether peace and prosperity could endure. As the Antonine dynasty approached its end, tension resurfaced. The decisions of the emperors, although benevolent, could not prevent the erosion of power. The lack of a clear method of succession and internal struggles weakened the foundations of the empire. The impact of these dynasties was profound. Each emperor shaped the destiny of Rome. The era of the Julio-Claudians, Flavians, and Antonines brought greatness, but also the vices of power. History teaches that empires, like human beings, are vulnerable to their ambitions. As this journey concludes, the enduring analysis is whether Rome could have maintained its splendor had the decisions of its emperors been different. The secrets of its history are still being investigated. The answer to these questions leads us to the next chapter, where the light of a new phenomenon will begin to illuminate the horizon: the rise of Christianity. The peace and stability forged during the Roman peace were shaken by a new religious phenomenon that, at first glance, might seem like a mere whisper. However, Christianity, a faith born in Judea, would begin to expand vigorously throughout history. In this chapter, we will explore the rise of Christianity from its humble beginnings as a persecuted sect to becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire, a process that would transform the faith of millions and the very fabric of Roman society. The historical context in which this transformation unfolds is fundamental. By the end of the 1st century after Christ, the Roman Empire was at the height of its power. However, Roman society was living in a state of spiritual unrest. Ancient pagan beliefs began to wane in the face of growing discontent. Traditional religion, centered on the worship of Roman gods and the emperor, failed to satisfy the yearnings of a population longing for something deeper. Thus, in this crucible of contradictions, Christianity emerged, promising salvation and hope. The key figures in this story are the apostles and followers of Jesus of Nazareth. Among them, St. Peter and St. Paul stand out as fundamental figures. St. Peter, considered the first pope, was a charismatic leader who began to preach in Jerusalem and beyond. For his part, St. Paul, a converted Pharisee, rose as the architect of Christianity in the Greco-Roman world. His letters not only strengthened the faith, but also established the theological foundations of the Church. It is pertinent to analyze what motivated these men to risk their lives in an empire that regarded them as enemies. The decisions of these men were crucial, as persecutions intensified under emperors like Nero, who blamed Christians for the fire of Rome in the year 64 after Christ. The faith did not extinguish. Instead, the martyrs became symbols of resistance. Christian communities emerged in the catacombs, creating a sense of belonging. Paul decided to take the message to the Gentiles, breaking cultural barriers and founding churches in strategic cities such as Corinth and Ephesus. This audacity was a turning point. Christianity ceased to be a Jewish sect and became a global movement. As time progressed, Christianity continued its march. In the 2nd century, the first Christian communities organized, creating a support network. The empire's apprehension towards this new faith intensified, but instead of intimidating, the persecutions fueled fervor. It is debated whether adversity provided the necessary forging for such a radical movement. The faith, nourished by the sacrifice of the martyrs, became a beacon of hope. The immediate consequences of this growth are palpable. The Christian religion began to infiltrate all levels of society. Pagan festivities started to lose their appeal, while the Christian community offered a celebration centered on faith and brotherhood. However, the most significant transformation occurred under the reign of Constantine, who, after his conversion in the year 312 after Christ, promulgated the Edict of Milan in 313, granting freedom of worship. This decision was a milestone. Christianity not only ceased to be persecuted, but rose as the official faith of the empire. It is pertinent to analyze how this mass conversion affected Roman identity. The question that this process leaves is profound. As Christianity established itself, tensions arose with pagan traditions. Old customs began to disappear. It is debated whether this transformation was an advancement towards civilization or a loss of Rome's rich cultural heritage. The questions are numerous. As Christianity solidified, the Roman Empire began to face challenges that threatened its stability. The newly established faith would be part of a more complex fabric. The next stage will take us to the crises of the 3rd century, where the fragility of Roman greatness will be put to the test. It is pertinent to analyze whether Christianity, now embraced by power, could withstand the storms that loomed ahead. History, as always, has its own secrets to reveal. The rise of Christianity revealed itself in a labyrinth of challenges that threatened the essence of the Roman Empire. In the 3rd century, Rome, which had enjoyed a period of splendor under the Roman peace, faced a tumultuous awakening. Political instability, external invasions, and economic crises began to unleash chaos that would shake the foundations of the empire. The historical context preceding this crisis is fundamental. The death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 after Christ marked the end of the era of the 5 good emperors, giving way to a period where political instability became the norm. The successors of Marcus Aurelius were unable to maintain the same authority. The lack of a clear system of succession led to a series of usurpations and power struggles. In the following decades, Rome found itself overwhelmed by a cycle of ephemeral emperors, where the throne passed from one general to another, often through violence. In this context, crucial figures emerge. One of the most prominent was Emperor Septimius Severus, who ruled from 193 to 211 after Christ. Severus, a military man of African origin, consolidated his power through the loyalty of the legions. However, his death left a vacuum that was filled by the ambition of other generals. The era of the soldier emperors was established, where command was maintained through military force. As political instability intensified, Rome also found itself under increasing external pressure. The borders of the empire were vulnerable to incursions from Germanic tribes to the north and Persians to the east. In the year 260 after Christ, Emperor Valerian became the first Roman emperor captured by a foreign enemy, the Persian king Shapur III. This event was not only a humiliation but also left the borders exposed, generating fear and distrust. The economic crisis was also beginning to take shape. The cost of maintaining the vast army and administrative corruption led to rampant inflation. The currency was devalued. Economic difficulties led to a decline in agricultural production and, consequently, to a food shortage. It is pertinent to analyze whether the economy was the only factor in the decline or if there was a deeper social unrest. The development of these events was a prolonged process. The decade from 250 to 260 after Christ witnessed a series of emperors who, unable to stabilize the situation, became mere pawns. Emperor Gallienus, who came to power in 253, tried to implement reforms, but his lack of resources left him vulnerable. Meanwhile, Rome began to fragment, with regions such as the Gallic Empire and the Palmyrene Empire proclaiming their independence. The immediate consequences were devastating. The fragmentation of the empire not only weakened its political structure, but also eroded the trust of the citizens. Cities became battlegrounds. The prevailing chaos led to an increase in internal revolts. The legions, which had traditionally been the backbone of the empire, became embroiled in politics, choosing and deposing emperors. As the crisis deepened, the central question was posed with greater urgency: whether Rome could find its way back to cohesion, or if it was doomed to be an echo of what it once was, trapped in a cycle of conflict. The history of 3rd century Rome is a puzzle of political intrigue, power struggles, and existential challenges. The inability of leaders to unify left Roman civilization on the brink of the abyss. However, amid this storm, figures emerged who would attempt to restore order, albeit at a high cost. Thus, the 3rd century became a turning point, a period that not only reflected the fragility of the empire but also laid the groundwork for the reforms that would follow. With the crisis still present, the empire would face its greatest challenge with the arrival of Diocletian, whose reforms would be the last hope. In this way, the history of Rome in the 3rd century leaves us with a question: could the transformation of an empire on the brink of collapse be the key to its resurgence? In the next chapter, we will explore how Diocletian implemented a series of bold reforms that would change the face of the empire. The crisis of the 3rd century triggered a series of radical changes in the structure of the Roman Empire. By the end of the century, the empire was engulfed in chaos that threatened to consume it. Invasions, political fragmentation, inflation, and corruption sowed despair. Amid this landscape, one man would rise as the decisive figure to attempt to save Rome: Diocletian. Born into a lower-class family in Dalmatia, Diocletian ascended through the military ranks, demonstrating tactical skill and political cunning. In the year 284, after a series of weak emperors, Diocletian proclaimed himself emperor, marking the beginning of an era of reforms. His vision was clear: to restore order and stability. The historical context in which Diocletian assumed power was a breeding ground for tensions. Neighboring empires lurked at the borders, while internal struggles weakened central authority. The imperial administration was on the brink of collapse, and the loyalty of the soldiers was uncertain. Diocletian knew that the empire required a fundamental restructuring. One of the first steps Diocletian took was to implement administrative reforms that divided the empire into smaller provinces. Instead of the vast regions of the past, Diocletian established a system of governors who could respond more quickly to crises. This change not only facilitated management but also allowed for greater tax collection. The costs of this restructuring on Roman identity are debated. As Diocletian consolidated his power, he also faced the need to reform the military system. The Roman legions had been weakened by corruption. Diocletian introduced a more rigorous approach, differentiating between military service and auxiliary forces. Additionally, he strengthened the borders by constructing new fortifications. This approach aimed to protect the empire and restore confidence in the army. However, these reforms were not well received by all. Senators watched as their power faded while Diocletian centralized authority. Internal resistance was a constant. In this context, the figure of Maximian stands out, who became co-emperor in the year 286, transforming the empire into a tetrarchy, a system in which 4 rulers shared control. This decision, although strategic, posed a new dilemma about whether 4 men could govern such a vast empire without falling into discord. The events that followed these reforms were a testament to Diocletian's vision and a harbinger of future struggles. The Tetrarchy allowed for a quicker response to threats, but it also sowed the seeds of division. Under this structure, Diocletian and Maximian ruled in the east and west, respectively, while Galerius and Constantius Chlorus became their Caesars. In this new order, the leaders had to act with exceptional coordination. As time progressed, Diocletian's reforms began to show their effects. Military campaigns succeeded in repelling invaders. The economy, although shaky, showed signs of improvement. However, the price was high. Diocletian's severity also manifested in a systematic persecution of Christians, seeking to eliminate what he considered a threat. This decision, although aimed at stability, left deep scars. The immediate consequences of Diocletian's reforms were complex. While he managed to temporarily stabilize the empire, tensions among the co-emperors began to grow. The lack of a clear succession plan and each one's personal ambition created an environment of rivalry that threatened to undo everything. The vision of a united empire began to fade. Thus, the question of Diocletian's chapter presents itself before us. It is debated whether his authoritarian approach and radical reforms could save an empire that was already showing signs of irreparable decline, or whether, on the contrary, they sowed the seeds of its future collapse. The story of Diocletian is not just a narrative of reforms. It is a reminder that even the most visionary leaders faced dilemmas. As the empire stood on the brink, another figure emerged on the horizon: Constantine. His rise and conversion to Christianity would mark the next chapter, a change that would transform the very identity of the empire. The lingering question is how Rome would respond to this new leader. The reform of Diocletian paved the way for a monumental transformation that would forever change the face of Rome. At a time when the empire was divided, the figure of one man emerged as a beacon of hope and controversy. Flavius Valerius Aurelius Constantine, known as Constantine the Great. His rise to power was not a mystery in itself, but rather the prelude to a deeper question that would connect him to Christianity, a faith that had been persecuted until then. At the beginning of the 4th century, the Roman Empire faced challenges that weakened it: struggles for the throne, pressure from tribes at the borders, and a declining economy created instability. The figure of Diocletian, who had attempted to restore order, left a legacy of divisions. With the Tetrarchy, the empire seemed more fragmented than ever. However, amidst this confusion, a space opened for new leadership. Constantine, son of Constantius Chlorus and Helena, was a military leader of great skill. After the death of his father, he became embroiled in the struggles for power. But his career took a decisive turn in the year 312 after Christ, when he faced Emperor Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, a conflict that would mark the beginning of his connection with Christianity. According to tradition, before the battle, Constantine had a vision of the symbol of the Chi-Rho, accompanied by the phrase "In hoc signo vinces," "With this sign you will conquer." This event led him to adopt Christianity as part of his policy. Constantine's victory over Maxentius not only granted him control of Rome, but also unprecedented legitimacy. With his rise, he began to implement policies that favored Christians. In the year 313, together with Licinius, he promulgated the Edict of Milan, which guaranteed freedom of worship for Christians. This act was not only a milestone in the history of Christianity, but also represented a radical change in the relationship between the state and religion. Constantine's legacy was not limited to his religious policies. In the year 330 after Christ, he founded a new capital, Constantinople in present-day Turkey. This move was a symbolic act intended to merge the Greco-Roman heritage with Christianity. By relocating the capital, Constantine sought not only a strategic refuge, but also aimed to establish a new center of power that reflected his vision of a Christian empire. The foundation of Constantinople, with its impressive architecture, became a symbol of the new era. The city housed not only palaces and temples, but also a population that began to experience the Christian faith as part of its identity. However, this new order was not without tensions. As Christianity consolidated, internal divisions arose. The Council of Nicaea, convened by Constantine in the year 325 after Christ, was an attempt to unify doctrine, but it also exposed the deep divisions among believers. Constantine's decisions had immediate and lasting consequences. The legitimization of Christianity not only allowed the faith to expand, but also altered the social fabric. Ancient pagan cults began to decline. It is pertinent to analyze whether this was a genuine conversion of Roman society or a superficial change. The question surrounding Constantine is profound. There is debate over whether he was a true defender of the Christian faith or a shrewd politician who used Christianity as a tool to consolidate his power. Historical sources offer a contradictory picture. The figure of Constantine thus becomes a symbol of human complexity, a man who, in his quest for glory, left an indelible mark on both Christianity and the fate of Rome. Through his decisions, Constantine not only transformed the empire, but also left an unresolved question: what is the price of power when intertwined with faith? This intersection of religion and politics would mark the path toward the division of the empire that was to come, a path that will be explored in the next chapter. The conversion of Constantine manifested in a division that would resonate throughout history. On the threshold of a new millennium, the Roman Empire found itself at a critical juncture marked by political instability, internal conflicts, and external threats. The consequences of past decisions were evident, and the empire, a vast network that once united countless cultures, began to show signs of fracture. The figure of Diocletian, who had attempted to save the empire, started to fade, leaving behind a legacy of changes that would transform the structure of power. The historical context in which this separation emerged is fundamental. At the end of the 3rd century and the beginning of the 4th, the Roman Empire was besieged by enemies at its borders: the Goths to the north, the Persians to the east, and internal revolts. This environment of crisis was the breeding ground for ideas about division. The immensity of the empire made administration increasingly complex. There was debate over whether it was truly possible to govern such a vast empire from a single capital. In this context, the figure of Constantine rises as an agent of change. Acclaimed for his victories, Constantine not only became emperor, but also the architect of its transformation. His decision to move the capital to Byzantium in the year 330 after Christ renamed Constantinople marked a milestone. This move was not merely geographical, it was a symbolic act of the new era that was approaching, where East and West would begin to take divergent paths. The choice of Constantinople presented itself as a response to external threats and as a cultural center that would rival Rome. Amid these changes, other actors played crucial roles. Emperor Maximian, Constantine's colleague, also sought to stabilize the empire, but his approach was different. While Constantine looked eastward, Maximian focused on the west, reinforcing the borders. The lack of communication and the disparity of objectives between the two emperors reflected the growing disorganization. Thus, the decisions of these leaders laid the groundwork for a division that was not only geographical, but also cultural and political. The development of events that led to the division can be traced through several phases. After the death of Diocletian, the system of tetrarchy he had established began to crumble. The struggle for power among the successors, especially between Constantine and Licinius, led to open conflict. Constantine's victory at the Battle of Chrysopolis in the year 324 after Christ not only solidified his position as the sole emperor, but also set the stage for a future division. The consolidation of power in a single figure was necessary, but it also meant that tensions between the regions would intensify. The immediate consequences of these events were profound. By establishing Constantinople as the new capital, Constantine not only ensured a more robust defense, but also initiated a process of Hellenization that would transform Roman culture, architecture, art, and religion. In this new center of power would influence each other. It is pertinent to analyze what implications this would have for the western part of the empire, which now felt neglected. The distance and lack of strong leadership began to create a void. The question surrounding this division is complex. There is debate over whether the separation of the empire was a necessary measure for its survival or the beginning of its decline. The creation of two halves, each with its own realities, led to a series of conflicts. While the Eastern Roman Empire strengthened, the Western Empire found itself adrift, facing invasions and crises that would culminate in its collapse. The division of the empire also raised questions about identity. There is debate over who the Romans truly were in this new context. The culture and citizens of the East, who embraced Christianity and Hellenization, began to differ from their Western counterparts. This shift in cultural identity would be one of the most enduring legacies. In conclusion, the division of the Roman Empire was an event that transformed not only its political structure, but also its cultural fabric. The decisions of leaders like Constantine in the context of Crises determined the future of a civilization. But as with everything in history, while some answers emerge, others remain shrouded in shadow. It is pertinent to analyze how much of Rome's greatness was lost in this separation and what secrets awaited in a divided empire. As the division solidified, a new phenomenon loomed on the horizon. The fall of Rome was approaching, an event that would forever transform the map of Europe. In the next chapter, we will unravel the events that led to the dissolution of the Western Roman Empire and the arrival of the invaders, a change that would mark the end of an era. The division of the empire quickly turned into a devastating collapse. The Western Roman Empire, which had reached its peak, began to show the cracks of a system in precarious balance. The decline was not a sudden event, but a series of interconnected occurrences that defined the fate of Rome. In this chapter, we will explore the factors that led to the fall of Rome, a process that encompassed everything from internal corruption to invasions, a repercussion of the past that would resonate throughout European history. By the late 4th century and early 5th century, the historical context was marked by an empire that, although vast, found itself in a state of vulnerability. The borders of Rome were weakening under the constant pressure of Germanic tribes. As social cohesion disintegrated, the corruption and ineffectiveness of the leaders became an evident problem. The economy, drained by centuries of war, faced difficulties that fueled discontent. The population, divided between the rich and the poor, created a breeding ground for destabilization. Key figures emerged in this grim landscape. One of the most notorious was Emperor Honorius, who reigned from 393 to 423 after Christ. His inability to manage external threats, combined with his reliance on generals like Stilicho, highlighted the fragility of leadership. Stilicho, a general of Vandal origin, made critical decisions to maintain the integrity of the empire. However, his death in 408 left a power vacuum that exacerbated instability. There is debate over whether the fate of Rome could have changed had his leadership been sustained. The development of events leading to the fall of Rome is an intricate tapestry of battles and fatal decisions. In 410 after Christ, the city of Rome was sacked by the Visigoths led by Alaric, an event that symbolized the loss of Roman power. This siege not only destroyed the city, but also shattered the myth of Rome's invulnerability. It is pertinent to analyze how the city that had dominated the known world could fall. The invasions were not limited to the actions of Alaric. Other groups, such as the Vandals and the Huns, began to besiege the borders of the empire. The Battle of the Catalaunian Fields in 451 was a crucial point where the Roman general Aetius joined forces with the Visigoths to confront Attila, the king of the Huns. Although the coalition managed to halt the invasion, the cost was high. Victories became an illusion. Internal struggles and political rivalries led to the fragmentation of authority, while the increasingly organized Germanic tribes found the perfect opportunity to invade. The immediate consequences of these incursions were devastating. The economy collapsed, infrastructures deteriorated, and the morale of the population plummeted. Distrust between citizens and the government intensified. The Roman elites, more concerned with their own interests, contributed to an irreversible setback. Decline loomed over the cities, and the idea of Rome as a safe haven began to fade. The question surrounding the fall of Rome persists. There is debate over whether it was the inevitable result of an empire too large to govern itself, or if the decisions of a few men sealed its fate. Historians still discuss whether the collapse was the result of internal factors such as corruption, or of external forces besieging its borders. As the empire crumbled, the story of Rome did not end. The legacy of its culture, its law, and its institutions would continue to resonate. However, the fall of ancient Rome marked the beginning of a new era in which the past would intertwine with the reality of a transforming world. In the next chapter, we will explore how the legacy of Rome remained alive through its influence on the culture and institutions of Europe, even amid the chaos that followed its fall. It is pertinent to analyze what secrets this empire would carry with it. The fall of Rome not only marked the end of an empire, but also the beginning of a question that has endured through the centuries. How could such a powerful civilization fade away and yet leave such a profound legacy? The influence of Rome resonates in the structures of power, law, and culture that still shape the world today. It is pertinent to analyze what made Rome a lasting force in history. Historical context. The centuries that followed the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the year 476 after Christ witnessed a radical transformation in Europe. Political fragmentation and the invasion of Germanic tribes created a power vacuum that did not erase the traces of a civilization that had dominated the known world. Amidst the chaos, Roman ideas and structures persisted, shaping the new medieval Europe. The Church, in particular, emerged as a bastion of Roman heritage, preserving not only Christian teachings but also the legacy of law and administration. Key figures and decisions. Among the actors who played a crucial role in preserving the Roman legacy was Pope Gregory I, who, in the 6th century, dedicated himself to consolidating the authority of the Church and establishing a moral order based on Christian principles, while also incorporating elements of ancient Rome. Under his leadership, the Church became not only a spiritual refuge, but also a center of political power. At the same time, Germanic leaders such as Clovis, king of the Franks, began to adopt Roman customs and laws, seeking to legitimize their rule. Development of events. As the Germanic tribes settled, Roman influence adapted. The kingdoms that emerged, such as the Kingdom of the Franks, were based on Roman administrative organization. Laws, inspired by Roman law, began to be established in the form of codes. The Edict of Milan by Constantine, although earlier, left a profound mark, promoting religious tolerance and laying the foundations for canon law. Simultaneously, the figure of the emperor transformed. European monarchs began to see themselves as successors to the Roman emperors. This is evident in the coronation of Charlemagne in the year 800 after Christ, where Pope Leo III bestowed upon him the imperial crown, an act that symbolizes the continuation of the Roman legacy in a Christian context. immediate consequences. The direct impact of these decisions was significant. The continuity of Roman administrative and legal structures provided a framework that allowed the new kingdoms to establish stable order. Roman law not only became the basis for new legal codes, but also influenced the development of jurisprudence. The institutions that emerged from this fusion laid the groundwork for the feudal system and medieval monarchies. However, the legacy of Rome was not limited to politics and law. Roman culture continued to flow through Europe. Literature, architecture, and medieval art were profoundly influenced by Roman models. Gothic cathedrals, although radically different in style, carried the heritage of Roman monumentality, the enigma of the chapter. Despite these evidences of continuity, a question arises: how could such a vast empire leave behind such a fragmented legacy? Why, instead of a clear unification, did an amalgamation of traditions occur that resulted in a mosaic of cultures? This analysis of the nature of the Roman heritage leads us to reflect on the relationship between collective memory and history. As the influence of Rome continued to resonate, the world that was once its domain was preparing for a new phase. The ancient empire, although fallen, would remain alive in the collective imagination. There is debate about what secrets awaited in the depths of history. The transition to the Middle Ages and the kingdoms that emerged from the ashes promised to unveil more mysteries about how the legacy of Rome would be redefined. As we delve into the next chapter, we will discover how the survival of the Eastern Roman Empire, known as Byzantium, not only kept the Roman flame alive, but also transformed the way it would be remembered. The fall of Rome gave way to a new reality. While the Western Roman Empire crumbled under the weight of invasions, in its shadow, the Eastern Roman Empire began to forge its own destiny. This chapter invites us to discover how Byzantium not only survived but transformed into a center of civilization, culture, and power in a constantly changing world. The historical context of this transformation is of vital importance. In the 5th century, as Rome fell, the Eastern Roman Empire found itself in a privileged position. Its capital, Constantinople, built upon the ruins of Byzantium, became a hub of trade and culture. In this environment, the wealth of the city, its strategic location between Europe and Asia, and its imposing walls offered unique protection. However, the atmosphere was tense. The pressure from Germanic tribes and the ambitions of Persia loomed. Thus, the Byzantine Empire would be defined not only by its Roman legacy but by its capacity for adaptation. The characters that emerge in this narrative are key figures. One of the most prominent was Justinian I, emperor between 527 and 565. His vision was clear: to restore the ancient splendor of Rome. With his wife Theodora by his side, Justinian undertook reforms to unify the empire under a single law, the Corpus Juris Civilis. His ambitions were not limited to legislation. He also sought to reclaim the territories lost in the West, which led him to military campaigns in Italy and North Africa. However, his legacy would not only be defined by war, he would also be remembered for the construction of the majestic Hagia Sophia, a symbol of Byzantine art. Justinian's decisions were not without controversy. While seeking glory, he also had to confront internal revolts, such as the Nika Revolt in 532, where his government was on the brink of collapse. The suppression of this revolt, which resulted in thousands of deaths, demonstrated the fragility of imperial power. It is debated whether this brutality was necessary to safeguard the empire or if it was a reflection of a leader's desperation. The unfolding of events in these decades reflected the tensions that defined the Byzantine Empire. While Justinian attempted to consolidate his power, the empire also had to deal with the constant threat of the Persians in the east and the incursions of Slavs and Avars in the north. These pressures forced the empire to develop an innovative military strategy and to strengthen its defenses. The immediate consequences of Justinian's decisions were profound. While he temporarily managed to reclaim territories, the cost was high. The wars drained the empire's resources, and as time passed, the dream of total restoration faded. At his death, the empire had changed, but not as he had anticipated. The pressure from external enemies, combined with internal conflicts, would begin to wear down the structure of the empire. The question that persists in this era is clear. How could an empire that had survived the fall of Rome and had flourished under Justinian face such monumental challenges and, despite everything, continue to exist? It is debated what secrets and strategies kept alive the flame of a legacy that many thought extinguished. The history of Byzantium is not just that of a surviving empire, it is that of an entity that unfolds over the centuries, a testament to human resilience. With the aftermath of the fall of Rome still fresh, Byzantium entered a new era marked by the influence of Greek culture and Christianity intertwined with its Roman past. The future of the empire, however, would be no less uncertain. In the next chapter, we will explore how this Roman legacy intertwined with the emerging currents of the Middle Ages, shaping a new world. We will analyze what traces Rome would leave in the formation of medieval Europe and what secrets still lay hidden in its history. The uncertainty that loomed over the Roman Empire at the end of its existence not only marked its collapse but also sowed the seeds of a new order in Europe. The structures of power, philosophical ideas, and cultural traditions that had flourished under the Roman banner did not disappear. Instead, they transformed. The Middle Ages, with its own set of complexities and challenges, is a testament to how the Roman legacy continued to influence the development of Europe. To understand the Roman influence in the Middle Ages, it is essential to immerse oneself in the historical context. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the year 476 after Christ did not mark the end of civilization, but a paradigm shift. The fragmentation of central power and the invasion of Germanic tribes led to a Europe that, at first glance, seemed to have regressed. However, in this chaos, the manifestations of Roman culture began to resonate in new forms. The cities, although devastated, were not abandoned. They became regional centers where Roman traditions mingled with new influences. As political structures crumbled, some leaders emerged determined to rebuild on the foundations that Rome had left. One of the most significant figures was Charlemagne, king of the Franks, who in the 8th century set out to restore the Roman legacy. Through his coronation as Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in the year 800, Charlemagne not only claimed the heritage of Rome but also revived the idea of a Christian empire. His decision to promote education, art and culture was a clear manifestation of Roman policies. The development of ecclesiastical institutions also played a crucial role. The Church, which had survived the fall of the empire, emerged as the moral and social authority. The figure of the Pope began to acquire a power that rivaled that of the ancient emperors. The decisions made by ecclesiastical leaders shaped culture, following the Roman model of establishing schools that preserved classical knowledge. It is debated whether this was the only form of continuity or if other factors fueled this connection. As the Middle Ages progressed, the feudal system emerged, but in its structure, remnants of Roman organization could also be glimpsed. The relationships of vassalage, although different, shared basic principles with the ancient patronage relationships. Feudalism became a new social fabric that, while distanced from ancient Rome, retained similarities in its hierarchy. The decisions of the nobles reflected the politics of alliances and conquests that had characterized Rome. However, this new order was not without conflicts. Tensions between the nobles and the church, as well as struggles for territorial control, created a landscape of instability that evoked the ancient power struggles of Rome. As cities began to resurge, a new sense of identity emerged that, while rooted in Roman heritage, transformed. The decisions of the bourgeoisie, who sought independence from feudal control, were a reflection of the desire for innovation. The repercussions of these events were profound. The influence of Rome became evident in art, architecture, and law. The construction of Gothic cathedrals was based on principles of Roman engineering. Roman laws served as the foundation for the legal systems that began to be established. Nevertheless, in this landscape of transformations, a question arose. How were Roman ideas preserved and reinterpreted in such a radically different context? As time progressed, the influence of Rome remained present, not as a mere memory but as an essential component in the construction of medieval Europe. This legacy leads us to question the nature of history itself and whether it is possible for a fallen civilization to influence the future in such a way. Thus, the chapter of Roman influence in the Middle Ages closes. But the complexity persists. The questions that arise are fundamental to understanding European development. The secrets of these changes are still being investigated. The history of Rome and its imprint on the medieval world is a testament to cultural and political continuity. In the next chapter, we will delve into the collective memory that has kept the myth of Rome alive, exploring how its legacy resonates in popular culture. We will analyze which stories have survived and what hidden truths may still be revealed. In the fragile balance between myth and reality, Rome emerges as an eternal question. In the previous chapter, we reflected on the influence of its legacy during the Middle Ages, a time marked by the repercussions of the ancient capital of the world. Now, at the end of our journey through Roman history, we find ourselves faced with a remarkable phenomenon: the persistence of the myth and history of Rome in contemporary popular culture and academia. It is pertinent to analyze how this city, which rose on the Italian peninsula more than 2,000 years ago, has managed to maintain its relevance in the collective imagination. Today, Rome is not only presented as an ancient metropolis, but also as a symbol of power and culture. Its history has intertwined with the narrative of later civilizations, creating a legacy that transcends time. There is debate about what factors have contributed to this unbreakable fascination. In this chapter, we will unravel the historical context surrounding the perception of Rome, the figures who have shaped its representation, and the impact of their decisions on collective memory. The memory of Rome develops in a constantly shifting political and social environment. From its fall in the 5th century to the Renaissance, the history of Rome became a mirror in which emerging nations sought to reflect their own power. During the Middle Ages, the figure of Rome transformed into a legend, a symbol of papal authority. However, the influence of its imperial past projected onto European communities, fueling both admiration and fear. In the Renaissance, the rediscovery of the classical world sparked a revival of interest in antiquity. Humanists such as Petrarch and Machiavelli explored Roman works, reviving its philosophy and politics. It was a period in which Rome was seen as a beacon of knowledge. The decisions of these thinkers, in their quest for inspiration, helped cement the image of Rome as the epicenter of culture. The development of events that marked the collective memory of Rome is a remarkable journey. As the Industrial Revolution swept across Europe, the ancient city became a symbol of progress. The construction of monuments and the publication of literary works about Roman history fueled the collective imagination. Novels, paintings, and films began to narrate the splendor and tragedies of the city, bringing new generations closer to its rich heritage. It is pertinent to analyze how these artistic representations managed to transform the perception of Rome. Among the figures who have left an indelible mark on the memory of Rome are both its emperors and its detractors. Julius Caesar, Augustus, and Nero have been interpreted through various lenses. Each has contributed to the narrative of Rome. The decisions they made have been subjects of scrutiny and admiration. Caesar, for example, has become a symbol of ambition and betrayal, while Augustus is remembered as the architect of the empire. However, it is not only political leaders who have woven the narrative of Rome. Contemporary artists and philosophers have continued to explore its legacy. The works of authors such as Robert Graves and his novel *First Claudius* have revitalized interest in Roman history. These modern tales not only offer a glimpse into life in Rome, but also raise questions about morality and power. There is debate about whether, in our quest to understand the past, we are projecting our own aspirations onto the figure of Rome. The immediate consequences of this fascination with Rome are evident. From cinema to literature, the representation of Rome remains a pillar of popular narrative. Films such as *Gladiator* and series like *Rome* have brought back to life the splendor and brutality of the ancient civilization, while scholars continue to investigate. However, this glorification raises a question. Are we truly understanding the complexity of its legacy, or are we simply perpetuating a myth that often ignores the darker realities? As we delve into the question of this chapter, it is impossible not to wonder what secrets the ruins of Rome still conceal. The city, with its ancient temples, seems to whisper stories of greatness and decay. The search for its true legacy continues. In academia, the importance of Rome in establishing laws and systems of government is discussed. In popular culture, its duality is reflected. This ambivalence invites a deeper reflection on what it truly means to be Roman. At the end of our journey, Rome reveals itself not only as a city, but as a multifaceted concept. Its memory has been perpetuated in an incessant cycle of admiration and criticism, an influence that resonates through the centuries. There is debate about whether such a grand civilization can be represented in its entirety, or if there is always a part of its history that remains hidden. The history of Rome, with its richness and complexity, continues to be a subject that invites us to explore. Thus, we close this chapter, but we carry with us the lessons of a civilization that, despite its fall, remains alive in collective memory. The legacy of Rome, its culture, its ideas, and its myths endure in our societies. The eternal city leaves us with one final question: what part of ourselves reflects the essence of Rome? In this journey through time, we have discovered that Rome is not just a place on the map, but a journey that continues to resonate in every corner of our lives.